Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich, and I am very happy today to welcome to the program Pulitzer Prize winning writer Viet Thanh Nguyen. He's just published the novel that's called The Committed. It's the story of a Vietnamese refugee and spy that picks up where Viet Thanh Nguyen's last novel, The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 2016, left off. Now, these are books that, underneath an adventurous plot, explores the nature and lasting effects of colonization. Viet Thanh Nguyen is a professor of literature, English, and ethnic studies at the University of Southern California. And he has written a number of essays and op-ed pieces exploring issues around race, migration, and other topics, including a recent essay in the New York Times about his joy of teaching on Zoom. He joins us on Zoom. Viet Thanh, when we know you are in big demand these days, and so it means an awful lot to us for you to take the time to join us today. Thank you.
Hi, Mitch. Thanks for having me here with you today.
It's great to have you. We're obviously talking to you just after the news concerning a mass spree of killing of Asian women in Atlanta at the hands, what seems like all eight, are at the hands of a white man. This comes a year now into the pandemic, a pandemic in which Asian Americans have been scapegoated, in which we have seen the rise in anti-Asian crimes and violence against Asian Americans. Certainly, we have even seen this in the city that I'm broadcasting from, Oakland, California. Just why don't we begin there, since it seems to be on most people's minds these days? What is your reaction to what happened in Atlanta and what is happening generally right now in this country?
When the violence is already being positioned by the media, I think, as a we don't know exactly what took place here. Let's wait and see, what the motivations of the shooter are and so forth. And the shooter is saying it was a result of sex addiction, that he's blaming these women or these massage parlors for creating the conditions for his own problems, and that he's seeking to eliminate these problems. But I think Asian Americans as a whole have immediately concluded that this is, of course, a shooting that is driven by racist and sexist fantasies and inclinations that are deep-seated not only in this particular shooter, but throughout American society and throughout American history. So none of this takes us by surprise. Of course, it's still deeply upsetting at the same time, but we point towards a very long history of anti-Asian violence in the United States that has existed here as long as there have been Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. Perhaps many Americans are poorly cognizant of this history, but I can run through a whole laundry list of these kinds of crimes, which have targeted both men and women, and which have been couched in racist, sexist language, and also in the narrative of economic competition, both international and domestic. So all these things are wrapped up in this particular incident. And of course, during the pandemic, I think we've seen the exacerbation of these feelings because of pandemic stresses and because of the Trump administration's racist rhetoric around the Kung flu. But we should also be talking about the fact that anti-Asian feeling as a whole is latent in the United States and is ready to be triggered by a lot of things, not just by explicit racism, but by things such as, the contemporary stance of the United States that China is our number one economic, political, and military threat. When we say these kinds of things, even if we're saying them in a seemingly non-racist way, it's going to have racist blowback throughout this country, as we've seen before.
And this is a trend that we even see with the new administration, at least concerning China.
Yes, I mean, so Joe Biden, to his credit, has said, anti-Asian violence is wrong and we should stop it.
That's right.
But you have to remember that President Bush said the same thing around Muslims a week after 9/11. And yet these calls to be non-racist can have only limited effect when the entire country is geared towards Islamophobia or xenophobia as an outcome of economic and political and military policy. So, immediately after 9/11, Sikh Americans who were not actually even Muslims were targeted for racist violence and murder. So before President Bush made a statement and after President Bush made a statement, Sikh Americans were being killed by white supremacists in the United States. And so even with President Biden's, call for stopping anti-Asian violence, I don't think we're going to see a stop to anti-Asian violence.
I don't mean for you to go through the whole, what you call a laundry list of historic events that you can connect what is happening now to, but are there a few you can touch upon?
Well, I'm coming from Los Angeles, and in 1871, 17 Chinese men were lynched by a white and Latino mob in one of the worst incidents of mass lynchings in American history, perhaps the worst. So that's just a sign that this has been pervasive throughout American history. But of course, we can also point to entire mass events like the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And the fact that anti-Asian racism in the United States is inseparable from anti-Asian racism outside of the United States. So whatever the United States does in terms of its foreign wars and its economic policies abroad is going to have a blowback here. So I think that the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II is completely tied to the firebombing of Japanese cities during World War II and the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That a generalized idea that Asian lives are worth less allows Americans as a whole to do these things abroad and domestically. And when we're speaking about economic competition leading to racist fear and violence, I can point to, of course, the most notorious incident in recent history, which was the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin by two Detroit auto workers who mistook him for Japanese and blamed Japan for the economic troubles of the United States, which was exactly the rhetoric that was widespread throughout the United States in the 1980s, that we were at trade war with Japan. And when we say things like that, we're going to see violence result.
It's interesting, and especially I think overall our lack of knowledge of such events. I remember interviewing many years ago Gene Pfizer, who wrote a book about the history of discrimination against the Chinese in this country. And her book begins with an account in the city that I was born in, Antioch, California, in which there was a Chinese community there that was actually run out early in the 19th or late in the 18th century. And I never even knew of that history, even though I was from that area. And I'm pretty sure people who live there now don't know about that history.
And yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, the one incident I mentioned in 1871, that's a huge amount of death that took place, but almost no one outside of the Asian American community has heard of it, and a lot of Asian Americans haven't heard of it themselves. And so throughout the second half of the 19th century, you saw a lot of these kinds of incidents, small and large, taking place directed against Chinese workers. And you have to remember that the Chinese came to the United States because they were brought here to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, but when their economic usefulness was over, then they were being targeted by the media and by politicians who were stoking white working class fears of Chinese economic competition. And the culmination of all of that was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. So when we're talking about anti-Asian violence, it's not only the physical acts of violence, but also policies like internment and exclusion, which were directed at keeping the Chinese out of this country. And for the Chinese who were inside this country, it was also a violent policy because most of the people who came from China were men. They were not allowed to bring wives or women with them. And the intention of that policy was to obviously prevent the growth of a Chinese community in the United States. So this had terrible human consequences for the Chinese immigrants who stayed in the United States as well.
You've experienced this personally and within your family. You grew up in San Jose in the Bay Area. The Bay Area is a forgotten city. It's our largest city in the Bay, but least talked about. But your parents owned a grocery store, and my understanding is they one, or I don't know the whole story, but I know there was an attack that involved a gunshot against your parents.
Well, my parents, came as refugees and in 1978 opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, which is what you're supposed to do when you're an immigrant or a refugee, pursue the American dream. So they did that. So it's kind of a surprise for me to walk down the street from my parents' store when I was a young boy and see a sign in a window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And of course, I didn't understand it at the time, but that sign was simply a part of a larger American story, another American driven out of business by fill in the blank. So, Asians have always filled in the blank. Different kinds of Asian populations have done that. My parents were, and the Vietnamese who came were just the newest population. And what was happening in downtown San Jose in the 1970s and 1980s was that no one wanted to open businesses there except for the Vietnamese refugees. And then, of course, what happened was that Silicon Valley took off, tax revenue grew, and then City Hall gentrified downtown San Jose, and my parents and many other Vietnamese refugees were forced to sell their businesses. So that's all a part of the cycle of gentrification in American history and so on. But so is this xenophobia and racism directed against newcomers who are only doing what they're supposed to do. And as far as the violence goes, of course, my parents were shot in their store on Christmas Eve. I don't know the race of the shooter or whether it was an anti-Asian incident, but we were also targeted in our own home by a white gunman who came to the door. And my mother, my parents had said, don't open the door because we could be, physically assaulted. We could be robbed at gunpoint, which is what all shopkeepers fear. But they opened the door to this particular person because he was white. He came to the door and said, "I have a letter for you." It was a trick, obviously, but but because he was white and spoke English, I think my parents opened the door. And so when we talk about anti-Asian violence and all this kind of thing, it takes place in a whole matrix of racial and economic relationships in the United States that involves Asians in relationship to Blacks and Latinos and whites and so on. And anti-Asian violence and segregation and all this is inseparable from this much larger, more complex history of how all these different populations have intersected.
The cycle of anti-Asian violence does work its way, and you work it into your two novels, The Sympathizer and The Committed. Is this a way of trying for you to make sense of that cycle of violence?
I mean, sure. I mean, as I've been stressing, the experiences of domestic anti-Asian racism and anti-Asian violence are inseparable from American foreign policy and American wars overseas. But I think a lot of Americans want to separate the domestic and the international, which is why for a lot of Asian American writers, I think it's perfectly acceptable to write novels that talk about the travails of being an immigrant or a refugee, the economic and cultural difficulties, because I think Americans are aware of the fact that racism does exist in American society, but it can be overcome. So it's normal for immigrants to encounter cultural and racial obstacles, but in the end, hey, you succeed. The American dream makes it happen. And the ultimate testimony is we have your novel as proof that the second generation Asian American succeeds even after the difficulties of the first generation. This is the prototypical ethnic American literary story, especially as expressed by Asian Americans. So in my own work, I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to write an autobiographical novel about me and my family and all the typical kind of stuff that Americans expect. I don't find that to be terribly interesting. So The Sympathizer and The Committed are instead novels that situate what happens to Asians in the United States in the larger context of these American wars. So The Sympathizer, for example, is about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army. And in 1975, when Saigon falls or is liberated, depending on your point of view, he flees with the remnants of that army to the United States to spy on their efforts to take their country back. And by so doing, he becomes a refugee and he becomes someone who confronts all these things that we've been talking about in terms of domestic anti-Asian experiences in the United States, which I treat in, I think, a hopefully comic manner. I mean, I satirize the anti-Asian Orientalism of the chair of Oriental Studies at Occidental College, and I have a long section dealing with Hollywood's racial mistreatment of Asians in the making of Vietnam War movies. And so, all these things are related. Things like the Hollywood treatment of Asians, whether it's Vietnam War movies or whether it's comedies like Breakfast at Tiffany's, all these things are acceptable ways to demean, silence, stereotype, sexualize, and objectify Asians and Asian Americans, which is all played for a joke or for entertainment in popular culture. But this is the way of priming Americans as a whole. And I think people all over the world through the power of Hollywood popular culture, priming people to accept that you can devalue and demean Asians, which then sets the conditions for anti-Asian racism and violence domestically or through war.
You and I are roughly the same age. We both grew up in the Bay Area. I may look a little older because I got some gray in the beard. But we were inundated growing up with these, what I'll call, quote unquote, Vietnam War movies and stories. And I say quote unquote because I see in your writings that in your op-eds, when you bring up the war, you call it the American War in Vietnam rather than necessarily the Vietnam War. Is that significant?
Well, that's what it's called in Vietnam itself. And of course, it makes sense because, for the Vietnamese, we have a long history of being colonized and being invaded and having to fight wars and so on and so forth. So the Americans were simply another iteration of this longer history. And of course, Americans didn't really understand that when they got involved in Vietnam. So to Americans, it was the Vietnam War because that was, it was American-centric experience for Americans. But in my book, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam in the Memory of War, which is a nonfiction work, I do also go on to say that for the victorious Vietnamese in Vietnam to call this the American War is a way of reversing the narrative and centering their own experiences. And of course, liberal Americans who want to acknowledge the ethnocentrism of American experience also call it the American War. But we have to remember, I point out in this book, that the war was also fought in Cambodia and Laos to enormously devastating consequences. In short, the human and material damage done to the Cambodia and Laos during the years of the war and afterwards was just as bad and arguably worse than anything that happened in Vietnam. So calling it the American War from the Vietnamese perspective also allows the Vietnamese to forget that they brought the war to Cambodia and Laos as much as America did. That the North Vietnamese were using Cambodia and Laos as staging grounds and for getting men and weapons down to the south. So they helped to pull Cambodia and Laos into the conflict as well. So the takeaway from this is that the United States should be held responsible for its ethnocentrism and for its imperialism and so on. But these tendencies are not unique. The Vietnamese themselves were also doing that. And just like everybody else, want to forget that they did those things too.
What does being held responsible mean for you?
I think for me as a writer, what I can do is hold the United States and in The Committed, the sequel, hold France responsible in terms of the narrative accounting in history and memory of what the French and the Americans did. And what's also important to point out is I also hold Vietnamese people responsible as well. So I'm an equal opportunity offender or an equal opportunity judge or whatever, however you want to put it. I don't think that the French and the Americans are unique, again, in going into other countries and invading them and occupying them and then justifying those experiences with high-flown rhetoric. For the French, that rhetoric was the civilizing mission. And for Americans, that rhetoric ranged from manifest destiny to the language of defending freedom and democracy. Now, the Vietnamese are also a very imperial people because Vietnam itself wouldn't exist without the conquest of much of Vietnam by the Vietnamese advancing from north to south. Much of South Vietnam is actually formerly the Kingdom of Cambodia and Champa. So we've done it too, but it all has to be put into context. And in my context is that France and the United States have been the imperial countries and the democratic countries that have defined much of Western history from the 18th century onwards around a narrative of the West going to save and rescue the rest of the world and to give them freedom and democracy, when in fact these things were done purely out of self-interest and masked colonization. Now, the French were explicitly colonial, and in my argument, the Americans have been colonizing as well, except that the Americans deny that they have been colonizers. They blame it on the Europeans. But in my phrasing, Americans have been colonizers, and they've simply called colonization by another name, and that name is the American dream.
It's interesting to me to hear you also talk about Vietnamese being and having imperial tendencies, because usually when I've heard over time about Vietnam, it's always been Vietnam that had been colonized, the United States, the French, and even for that, China. And I've heard for as long as 1,000 years.
So again, this is what the Vietnamese do. And they do it just like everybody else. They call themselves the victims, and we or they have been the victims, absolutely, of foreign domination, including those 1,000 years of Chinese colonization that no Vietnamese person will ever let you forget. But that narrative, again, allows Vietnamese people to conveniently ignore the imperialisms that they themselves engaged in. That, again, modern Vietnam would not exist without violent conquest and the appropriation of land. And the Cambodians have never forgotten that much of what is South Vietnam was formerly theirs. So we can point to the same impulse in the United States. 9/11, the United States gets bombed, 3,000 Americans die. It's a horrible tragedy, but it allows Americans to situate themselves as the victims. That was the narrative that the United States used after 9/11. We're the victims of this terrorist attack, which wouldn't have happened without the provocations of American intervention in other countries, which again are conveniently forgotten in this narrative that the only reason the United States is in the Middle East is to help out these countries of the Middle East and not for our own self-interest or for our own imperial ambitions. Again, the narrative of nations denying what they've done to others, but proclaiming their own victimization is exactly what Vietnam and the United States have participated in.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Viet Thanh Nguyen. In 2016, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his novel, The Sympathizer. He has now just published the follow-up book to that. It's called The Committed. And Viet Thanh Nguyen, I may be remiss here also not to bring up another recent book that was put out in 2019. This was a children's book that I think you had the collaboration of one of your children as well as Bay Area artist, T. Bui, called Chicken of the Sea. And I bring that up to kind of get us into your latest novel, The Committed, because I find that the Chicken of the Sea, this children's book, is about a group of chickens that go on an adventure on the sea. Well, the beginning of your book, The Committed, begins with Vietnamese refugees on the sea and taking, I think purposely so, this heroic journey through the Atlantic Ocean. Do you see a connection? I saw a connection there, but I didn't write these books, obviously. So was there?
Yeah, thanks for bringing it up, because Chicken of the Sea is actually purely my son's creation. He was like 5 years old. He hung out with me and T and other artists and so on at an artist retreat in Gerasi, which is right above Palo Alto. And he was so inspired that he came up, with a comic book, Chicken of the Sea, about bored chickens who become pirates. And I'd already been, not harassing him or hanging him, but I periodically tell him, hey, your parents are refugees, your grandparents are refugees. You came from something called the Vietnam War and from Vietnam. And so he, even as a 5 to 7 year old, is aware of these things. I mean, every now and again, he'll bring up the question of war and refugees and all this kind of thing. And I probably don't help it by giving him books that talk about very serious issues. So now at 7 years old, he's reading Persepolis, which is about the Iranian Revolution and its aftermath. And he loves it, right? Maybe a little bit, it might be over his head, but he still loves it. So maybe in his own mind, he made that connection, that there's a seafaring adventure here in which the refugees are involved. And maybe that's why he chose as his protagonist chickens, because they become pirates, but they're terrible pirates, So that's a way of both, using the pirate adventure that he loved so much as a kid, but softening it with these hilarious chickens who are, just incompetent at what they do. So for me, it was very deliberate to make the opening of The Committed a refugee narrative, because the Sympathizer ends with our sympathizer having returned to Vietnam and then fleeing again as a refugee on the open seas. And The Committed picks up exactly at that point. So the prologue is on this refugee boat. And what I'm gesturing at is something that I think most of your listeners are aware of, which is that in the 1970s and 1980s, tens of thousands of Vietnamese people fled communist Vietnam as refugees on boats, and they were called by the Western media boat people, which was a powerful term because we still remember it today. It's so powerful that the French, who really object to importing English words into their language, simply call the boat people les boat people, which I find terribly offensive in many different ways. But the offensiveness of this term is that it renders Vietnamese refugees as objects of pity, people who are desperate and frightened, which they were. But they were not, in my mind, simply to become objects of pity, because of these people who took to the open seas, many of them died. They never made it. And those refugees who embarked on this trip knew in advance that their odds were not great. And so when you do something like that, I think that's a heroic act, not just a desperate act. And yet the machinery of our Western culture and of these host nations is to demean refugees in order to either prevent them from coming into our countries, or if we accept them, to make sure that they're adequately grateful for what we're doing for them, which obscures, again, both their heroism and the fact that many of them are fleeing from situations that we have created or helped to create, whether that happens to be drug and gang wars in Latin America that generates so-called undocumented migrants who, in my mind, are really refugees, or whether it's American wars in Asia that generate refugees. So there's a line in The Sympathizer where my sympathizer says, well, I'm grateful for American aid, but maybe I wouldn't have needed American aid if you hadn't invaded us in the first place. So all this is obscured by the objectification of refugees. And so I want to make sure that we see them in heroic light, And that's why the language of this opening passage says it's not a refugee boat, it's an ark. Now, these biblical connotations. And there's a Homeric undertone to this opening, which gestures at the fact that, Ulysses was on a boat himself, but we don't call him a boat person. We cast him in these epic terms. And in our own mythology as Americans, our founding mythology, the pilgrims come here as heroic explorers, when in fact they were boat people. I mean, the pilgrims were just lucky that when they got here to the shores of the so-called New World, there wasn't a camera person awaiting them. Because I'm pretty sure the pilgrims looked pretty nasty when they got off their boat, unkempt, unshaven, lice-ridden, and so on. But instead, we remember them with these oil paintings of them in heroic terms. And that's part of what I want to do here with the opening of the Committed.
From boat people to people of the ark.
Yeah.
And that affects the way you see people today at the southern border. Another story that's obviously getting a lot of attention.
Sure, because we demean and dehumanize people coming from south of the border, or in another context, people fleeing from Africa on the Mediterranean on these dinghies and rafts and so on. It seems pathetic. Why would people want to do that? What kind of conditions are they living in that they would do these kinds of things? But again, if you see the world from the eyes of those who are embarking on these adventures, again, they're facing tremendous odds. They're embarking on long journeys. People who are coming from south of the border, the narrative of people coming is getting better known, of course, but they have to face tremendous obstacles and dangers, and coming not only from Mexico, but south of Mexico, in circumstances like riding on a train where they literally risk life and limb. If this was being undertaken by Americans, Hollywood would be making heroic movies about Americans doing this kind of thing. But instead, Hollywood makes heroic movies that are science fiction movies that situate white people doing these exact same things that people of color are doing, trying to get into the United States. So we dehumanize them, we demean their efforts and their perspectives so that we can forestall empathy and hospitality on our part, and we forestall recognition of what we do here that creates circumstances there that drives these refugee migrations.
Can't help but think, talking about Hollywood, I have noticed over time how there's all these Hollywood films about the world, or the United States in particular, being invaded by aliens, other countries maybe, but oftentimes, extraterrestrial beings, when in reality, it's usually the United States that's doing that to other places in the world.
Yeah, when I was growing up, I was in San Jose. I went to this elite high school that was mostly white, but there were some of us who were of Asian descent. And every day at lunch, we knew we were different. So every day at lunch, we would gather in a corner of the campus, and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. So the only language we had for ourselves was this sort of racist imagery. And the irony, as you just pointed out, is that we hadn't invaded the United States. The United States had invaded our countries of origin, or if invasion is too strong of a term, the United States at least had occupied some of our countries or invited itself in to some of our countries. We're talking here about the Philippines, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Korea, the Pacific Islands from Guam and Samoa to Hawaii. So a lot of Asians are here in the United States because of these interventions, to put it mildly, that the United States has done elsewhere.
Viet Thanh Nguyen, I am one of the throngs of followers that you have on Twitter. And I have followed how you've taken up the issue over these past few years of the amount of support that you actually find and found for Donald Trump within the Vietnamese American community. And I found that fascinating. And I don't want to overstate the amount of support. Feel free to sort of clarify that. But it did make me wonder about just a dynamic that you see from people that are fleeing other countries, especially communist countries, the way that maybe some Cuban Americans in Florida supported Trump as well. If that was sort of a similar dynamic that you find with the Vietnamese American community.
I think there's a lot of that happening. I want to stress that Asian Americans as a whole went 2-1 for Biden versus Trump. But the Vietnamese had the highest degree of support for Donald Trump, somewhere in the 40 plus percent range, and certainly the plurality of Vietnamese Americans supported Donald Trump. But apparently so did a lot of people in Vietnam. And there's a number of reasons for this. I think one of the dominant reasons is the perception that Donald Trump was taking a strong stance against China. And as we talked about, the Vietnamese really have a phobia against China because of these 1,000 years of Chinese colonization, and because China is obviously the big neighbor to the north of Vietnam. And so this was one of the key reasons for this kind of support. A number of other reasons, including the anti-communism of many of the Vietnamese American population, and their perception that the Republicans have been a stronger anti-communist party than the United States. Other reasons that have been posited by me or by others would include, let's be honest, a significant degree of anti-Blackness in the Vietnamese American population, which makes them susceptible both to anti-Blackness, but also to narratives of white supremacy or white domination, which I think Donald Trump was advancing explicitly and implicitly. And so there were some Vietnamese Americans who felt greater kinship or alliance with his vision and his stance than they would with Black Americans. And then maybe finally, a certain sense of nostalgia on the part of some Vietnamese Americans, the sense that they lost their country in war, and that they're trying to keep the memory of South Vietnam alive in the United States. I'm trying to figure out, why during the Capitol riot, you would see obviously Confederate flags and so on, but there were also South Vietnamese flags being flown by a sizable Vietnamese contingent there. And I just can't help but feel, but that nostalgia for a lost South Vietnam finds some rhyme and reasoning with some resonance with this supposed nostalgia for the Confederacy and the lost cause and so on, which is couched in, again, white supremacy.
That's interesting. The protagonist in both The Sympathizer and The Committed, same character, somebody that we never, he has aliases, but we never know his name. Is it, I don't have a lot of novelists on. Is it appropriate to ask a novelist why we don't have a name?
You can ask me anything you want. But so the question is, why are there no names for our protagonist, right? Well, I mean, there's a number of reasons for it. I wanted to have these novels function on multiple levels. I mean, they're spy novels, crime novels, entertainments. They're supposed to be thrilling and fun and all of that. So let me just stress, despite all the heavy topics we're talking about, these novels are supposed to be entertaining. And there's also a lot of satire and humor going on in them as well.
And sex.
And sex, yes. Yeah. Crime, drugs, violence, sex, all the good stuff that I like to read in books. But there's also another level, which is that I want these novels to also have a philosophical dimension and to also be about one man's internal struggles with who he is. And his struggles stand in for many other people's struggles. So he's meant to be an everyman, which is one reason not to give him a name. So I'm thinking back in particular to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which was a major influence on both of these books. And he too has an anonymous narrator there because the Invisible Man is supposed to stand in, I think, for a lot of Black experiences in the 20th century as well. So these novels are also supposed to be a commentary about Vietnamese experiences throughout the 20th century. And then, also what's at stake here is that I was aware, given my own experience, that Vietnamese names are hard for a lot of non-Vietnamese people to pronounce, spell correctly, and to remember. So if I had a book full of Vietnamese names, for better and for worse, a lot of people would think this is a foreign book. And that wasn't the particular fight I wanted to have in this book. So there are Vietnamese names, but they're judiciously used. But instead, his anonymity, our narrator, I think allows for greater identification from people who are not Vietnamese, besides those other dimensions of having an everyman narrative. And then a lot of the characters there are a lot of nameless characters in these books, and instead they're given epithets. So in The Committed, for example, we have the eschatological muscle and the handsome and humorless lawyer, and so on and so forth, which I hope are just as memorable and possibly more memorable than actual names. Yeah. And they gesture at, again, this Homeric tradition. When you read the Iliad, for example, characters have names, but they're identified primarily through a trait that they have. and we remember them for both the name and the trait. And so that's exactly what's happening in The Sympathizer and The Committed.
The protagonist, he is a refugee that leaves Vietnam. And this is really sort of in the first book, the Sympathizer, when he's in the United States in Los Angeles. Your second book, he goes to Paris, and we'll talk about that. But what I found really interesting, I wanted to ask you about, is when he's in the United States, he's also serving as a spy for the Viet Cong, and spying on Vietnamese American communities that were supportive of the Southern Vietnamese regime. Was that was that a common occurrence? Did that kind of thing actually happen? And did you have to research that to write this character and to write that story?
Well, we don't know for sure whether there were or are actual, spies from the communist regime in the post-75 era, but a lot of Vietnamese people believe that to be the case. And so there was an actual confirmed spy from Vietnam in the United States. His name was Pham Xuan An. His life has been documented in a couple of good books by American scholars and journalists. But he came to the United States in the 1950s and studied in Southern California at Orange Coast Community College. And his task was to learn the psychology and the culture of the United States so that when he went back to South Vietnam after that experience, he could work with Americans. So he became a major figure in the American scene in South Vietnam. He befriended all of the major American journalists, was a fixer for them, and so on. He was a trusted confidant. But at the same time, he was using his position to glean all kinds of intelligence that he was conveying to the communist side. He became promoted, I think, to a major general in secret during the war for the efforts that he undertook. So I knew of his story, and that was partly the inspiration for the Sympathizer. And then, what the Sympathizer depicts is that the anti-communist feeling in this refugee community, very strong for obvious reasons, also intersected with paranoia, so that anybody who was suspected of being a communist became a communist and would be targeted by the most fervent elements of the anti-communist community. So there were many incidents of Vietnamese journalists in the United States. They were refugees who created the Vietnamese language media, and some of them called for things like reconciliation or at least openness to dialogue with communist Vietnam. And several of them were targeted for violent attacks ranging from arson to shootings, and at least 2 or 3 of them were killed as a result of that. And that history is explicitly used in The Sympathizer to show the depths of feeling. And this idea that wars don't end simply because we say they're over. So the war is officially over in 1975, but Americans were clearly still obsessed with the war for decades after that. And for the Vietnamese refugees, they were carrying on that war within their own community, and they were trying also to carry the war back to Vietnam. So what is also true that forms the basis of the plot in The Sympathizer is that the Vietnamese refugee community was raising funds to send back to Thailand, where there was a contingent of Vietnamese veterans of the South Vietnamese Army who were training to invade Vietnam and stoke a counter-revolution. All that is part of The Sympathizer as well.
This is all within the Vietnamese American community. I mean, I don't know a lot about this. I do remember a few times over the years as a journalist kind of covering controversies that would erupt over the naming of part of a town, Little Saigon or Little Ho Chi Minh. And I mean, people were really passionate about that.
I don't even understand that controversy that you're referring to. It took place in San Jose, my hometown, but like San Jose, like Orange County has significant Vietnamese American populations who have done a great job in building up Vietnamese American commercial districts. And in Orange County, it was that district is called officially Little Saigon. There's a sign on the highway that tells you you're getting off at Little Saigon. So I don't know what the history is in San Jose exactly, but that never, I don't think that ever happened. There was no official Little Saigon designation. And there was a couple of, 2 or 3 different neighborhoods that could meet that designation. So at a certain point, this was about 10 years ago, I think, there was then officially an effort to come up with a name for one of these areas. And that's where all the controversy took place. And I forget the 2 names. One was like Vietnam Town and one was Little Saigon Business District or something like that. But whatever that difference was, it became a communist issue. Like one faction would decry the other faction as being a front for Vietnamese communists, for working with Vietnamese communists in Vietnam, and that if you supported this designation, you were also participating in this communist effort. It became extremely, extremely heated. Some of my in-laws became very passionate about this, and I was just completely confused as to which faction was which. But it just goes to show that, again, the depth of anti-communist feeling that still existed and still exists in this particular community.
It's starting to come back to me now. I was producing a news show at the time and arranging a debate. People were really angry at that and worked up over the issue. The Sympathizer largely takes place in Los Angeles. Why, with The Committed, do we end up in Paris?
Well, in The Sympathizer, it's very much about the American war in Vietnam and its consequences. So I definitely wanted to make sure that we ended up in the United States and set it in LA because that's where I live and I'm familiar with it. But in that novel, I set out to, as I've said before, offend everybody, by which I mean Americans, communist Vietnamese and anti-communist Vietnamese. And I think I succeeded, judging from my hate mail. And then after that, when it came time to write the sequel, I thought, well, who else is there left to offend? It has to be the French. So he goes to Paris in 1982 in The Committed. And one of the reasons why he goes is because he's part French. His father is a French priest who molested this young girl who is the narrator's mother. And so in The Committed, both for reasons of color and plot, but also for reasons of history and politics, I wanted to take him to Paris so I could be critical of what the French did in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, which they called Indochina. And basically, one of the things that I say is that the French got off easy. The French did terrible things in Indochina. I mean, they enslaved people. They forced them to do hard work for little money or no money. They appropriated land. They raped women. All these kinds of things. But they called it the civilizing mission. And they were lucky because, like the Pilgrims, there was limited technology available to record what they did. So ironically, Americans with their cameras and their full color motion pictures and so on have recorded their own atrocities or imagined their own atrocities for film. And so the rest of the world remembers the American war in Vietnam as a bad war. But for the French, we only really mostly have black and white photographs of the colonial era, which do a very poor job of documenting and conveying the horrors of French colonialism. But instead, we have a record of, French people in white linen suits living this kind of romantic colonial lifestyle. And the French magnified that with movies like Indochine, starring Catherine Deneuve in 1992 and The Lover in 1991. So the French have portrayed this whole history through this romantic gauze, and they themselves believe it. Because in France, as I've been told by many French people of Vietnamese descent, this history is barely treated at all. So one person I met said, here, look at this high school history textbook. There's 2 pages on India, which France was barely involved with, and 1 paragraph on Ho Chi Minh. So the French have done a very poor job of remembering what they did in Indochina, and it's been completely overshadowed by what the French did in Algeria, which is the major French preoccupation when it comes to colonialism and war. And so in the Committed, I want to make sure the French are reminded consistently of what they did, and also to connect what happened in Indochina with what happened in Algeria. That's one of the subplots of the book, when our narrator becomes a drug dealer and becomes involved with an ethnic Chinese Vietnamese gang. Their major rivals are an Algerian gang.
On that line, can you talk to me how the works and philosophy of somebody like Frantz Fanon played in your book, The Committed, and maybe just a little bit about who Frantz Fanon was?
Well, The Committed is The Sympathizer is very much an action-driven spy novel with a goal that our narrator has to achieve. He has to, spy on this effort and then rescue his friends. In The Committed, he's been devastated by the events of The Sympathizer. And so The Committed is very much a novel about someone who's lost. That's why he becomes a drug dealer. He's just trying to flail around and survive, and he makes some bad choices. And it's also a novel about someone who's trying to find himself and what he should do. So in The Sympathizer, he was a revolutionary with a revolution. He gets disabused of that communist revolution by the end of that book. So in The Committed, he's a revolutionary still, but he's in search of a revolution. So he's interrogating himself, what he believes in, his political beliefs, his philosophies, and all of that. And this is where someone like Frantz Fanon becomes very important, because Fanon, of course, was one of the preeminent anti-colonial philosophizers of the 1950s and early 1960s. He wrote Black Skin, White Masks, which is a really crucial meditation on the impact of racism on Black men's experiences and visions of themselves, and followed that up with The Wretched of the Earth, which is about the Algerian War. And it was taken by many people in the 1960s as a template for decolonizing revolution, especially in the fact that Fanon came down hard on the side of the necessity of violence in anti-colonial revolution. So he says in that book that violence can detoxify the colonized man, and violence is necessary for the self-respect of the colonized person. And so, knowing that, in The Committed, I wanted our narrator to engage with him, but other people who've thought about the colonial and decolonizing condition as well, both to portray that violence in operation and also to think about the consequences. So maybe violence is necessary in certain certain cases for decolonization. I mean, it's arguable that nonviolence would not have been successful in Algeria as it was in India. These are different conditions and circumstances, but regardless, violence also deforms. That is something that Fanon does not address. It may detoxify and get rid of the colonizer, but can it also deform and lead to sort of disastrous consequences in the post-colonial period? And he didn't live long enough to see that. He died young before the end of the Algerian Revolution. But from my perspective as a Vietnamese person whose family came from the losing side and from a community who was very bitter about the re-education camps that the Victorious Vietnamese instituted and all these other kinds of policies that happened after the end of the Vietnam War, I do think about the toxic consequences, not just the detoxification, but the toxic consequences of violent revolution. And that's partly what The Committed takes on.
Finally, at the beginning of the pandemic, I do as the Romans do. I read Albert Camus' The Plague, and it kind of sort of set the tone for me over the last year. Where in writing The Committed, did the pandemic at all affect this book, or is this something that was you had already completed, at least in your mind, before the pandemic began?
It was mostly done. My sense of time is completely screwed up, so I can't actually remember whether I finished The Committed during the pandemic or not, but it was mostly done at any rate. But really, what the pandemic really impacted was, both the release of the novel, which was delayed by several months because of the pandemic, but what the pandemic really affected is the book that I'm writing now, which is a nonfiction book that is part memoir and part political and cultural criticism, talking about many of the things that we've talked about for the last 40 minutes or so, Mitch. Mostly because I don't think my life is that interesting. So a straight autobiography would not be compelling to anybody, including me. But mixing in these discussions of what it meant to grow up as a refugee in the United States with this larger meditation about, the American attitudes towards race and colonization and all of that. And of course, the pandemic comes into play because while I was writing this book, we saw George Floyd being murdered. We saw the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw COVID-19 being characterized as the Kung flu and China virus by Trump. We saw the Capitol riot. All this stuff was happening. So all of that I think is a part of the book. And part of the claim that the book makes is that none of these things are new. I mean, it's new in the sense that I don't know if we've ever experienced all of these things happening in such a condensed way, so that it feels like a real crisis that we've been in the past 12 months. But all these things have happened before in American history. And that's because, the book claims, Americans have not adequately confronted that our country is built on contradiction. The patriots in our midst would say, no, America is great, love it or leave it. And I would say, America is a country built on contradiction. We have democracy, freedom, pluralism, all this wonderful rhetoric, and we have a country that's founded on genocide, colonization, slavery, and war. And we need to be able to talk about both of these contradictory dimensions at the same time. As F. Scott Fitzgerald said, the test of a fine mind is to be able to hold two opposing ideas in balance at the same time. And I think a lot of people don't want to do that because it's easier simply to narrate this country through one lens or the other. Whereas my insistence in the book is that this is a country that is based in both brutality and beauty, in both horror and hope. But we cannot achieve the beauty, the beautiful, and the hopeful if we don't do the hard work of confronting the horror and the brutality that's
I,
been a part of history.
I read in the paper that your memoir may be called Seek Memory, which is sort of a nod of Vladimir Nabokov's uh, memoir, Speak Memory.
That's
And
the working title.
yeah, and again, and it made me think. Again, we are roughly the same age, and I'm really realizing the older I get, the more I am finding memory to be a bit of a trip, and the less confidence I actually have in
Yeah.
memory.
I have no confidence in my own memory. I mean, we narrate ourselves to ourselves constantly, all the time. And memories both serve to justify our narratives of ourselves, but also our narratives of ourselves change our memories. So it's a circular kind of a pattern. But nevertheless, those memories are important. We have to work with them and through them. And sometimes we have to contest our own memories as well. Our memories may be faulty and may be self-serving. They may allow us to have selective memory about both ourselves, but about the past of our own country. So the book is about both the importance of memory, but the questioning of memory, and the need for recognizing selective memory at both the individual and collective and national levels as well.
Viet Thanh Nguyen has been our guest. He is Pulitzer Prize winning author. His latest book, a novel, is out. It's called The Committed. Viet Thanh Nguyen, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you dearly for taking the time to do this with us today.
Thanks so much, Mitch. It was a real pleasure.